Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, California. October 1959. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was 7 years into a 15-year sentence at Alcatraz, the maximum security prison sitting alone in San Francisco Bay, reserved for the most dangerous criminals in America. At 54, Johnson was doing time for federal narcotics conspiracy, one of roughly 260 inmates on the Rock, where escape was thought to be impossible, and tension lived just under the surface of strict routines and harsh rules. He'd been transferred there in June 1953, and by the fall of 59, Bumpy Johnson was a man to be respected. He carried himself with a quiet strength that made others take notice, regardless of race, crime, or background. A Harlem legend who'd built a fortune through illegal gambling, who'd survived gang wars and refused to bow to the Italian mob. Johnson was no ordinary inmate. Among black prisoners, he was something more. A symbol of black pride. A man who'd made it big in a world stacked against him. Someone who stood toe-to-toe with the mafia, who showed that black power didn't need permission to exist. But not everyone at Alcatraz respected Bumpy Johnson. One man in particular, a huge white inmate named Eric Pollson, would find out the hard way that disrespecting Bumpy came at a price. And no amount of muscle, violence, or reputation would be enough to save him. 17 former inmates, all present at Alcatraz in October 1959, later shared what they saw with Prison Chronicles between 1965 and 1970. What happened in the cafeteria on October 23rd wasn't the most violent act in Alcatraz history, but it became the most talked about, not because of how bloody it was, but because of how fast it happened, how precise it was, and how it brought an end to a week of rising racist harassment. Eric Pollson, 38 at the time, was the kind of prisoner Alcatraz was built for: brutal, cold, proudly racist, and completely without remorse. Standing 6 feet 4 inches and weighing about 275 pounds, nearly all of it muscle from years of lifting weights behind bars, Pollson had been convicted of 3 murders between 1954 and 1956. All of his victims were black men, all killed during armed robberies in Texas. Court records made it clear Pollson had deliberately chosen black victims. In his trial, he even said, "Killing Slur ain't really murder. It's pest control." When the judge called him a racist monster, Pollson laughed. And he promised if he ever got out, he'd do it again. After multiple assaults on black inmates in other prisons, Pollson was finally sent to Alcatraz in 1957, too dangerous for regular federal facilities. But he didn't stop. At Alcatraz, Pollson got smarter about his hate. No more open attacks that would land him in solitary. Now it was subtle, calculated, constant. He knew exactly what he was doing, said Marcus Williams, a former black inmate who served time at Alcatraz from 1958 to 1964. Williams saw the whole thing go down and spoke about it in 1968. Pollson didn't throw punches in front of the guards. He'd take your food off your tray like it was his, bump into you hard in the showers or in the yard, but make it look like an accident. He'd lean in close, whisper slurs when no one else could hear. He made sure you knew he didn't think we belonged there with him. Like we weren't real criminals. Like we were just garbage thrown in with white men who, in his mind, earned their spot. By October 1959, Pollson had spent 2 years building a name at Alcatraz. Not just for being racist, but for being dangerous. Most inmates kept their heads down around him. Even some white prisoners gave him space. Nobody wanted trouble with a man like that, but Bumpy Johnson wasn't just anybody. And Pollson was about to cross a line he couldn't walk back from. Inside Alcatraz, 1959. Guards watched Eric Pollson's behavior closely, but rarely stepped in. He knew how to stay just under the line. He never attacked anyone in a way that required real punishment. And though no one would ever admit it, some guards quietly approved. They didn't mind how he kept certain inmates in line. Pollson believed he was untouchable. He thought he could do whatever he wanted, said Marcus Williams, who was there. He'd killed 3 black men on the outside and felt no guilt. He was bigger and stronger than most guys inside. He'd been running his intimidation game for 2 years, and nobody had stopped him. So when Bumpy Johnson arrived in 1953 and slowly earned respect from inmates of all backgrounds, Pollson didn't like it. Johnson was 54 by the fall of 1959. Pollson was only 38, yet here was this older black man, respected by black and white inmates alike, a man who carried weight without lifting a finger. And that bothered Pollson. He couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand seeing someone like Bumpy treated like he mattered. Pollson decided he'd fix that. He'd break Bumpy down, humiliate him, show everyone that no black inmate, no matter how well respected, was above being put in his place by a real man. By him. The first confrontation began Friday, October 16th. During lunch in the main cafeteria, Johnson was sitting with 3 other black inmates eating quietly. As Pollson passed by with his tray, he reached out without stopping, grabbed Johnson's dessert, a small piece of apple pie, and walked to his own table. He sat down, ate the pie, and stared at Bumpy the entire time. Witnesses say Johnson glanced at his now empty tray, looked at Pollson, and then just kept eating. No reaction, no anger. We were ready to fight, Williams recalled. We were ready to jump up right then. But Bumpy just gave a small shake of his head, told us to stay calm. He went back to his food like nothing happened. At first, they thought Bumpy was scared. That Pollson's size had him hesitating. But later, they understood. Bumpy wasn't afraid. He was setting a trap. He was giving Pollson just enough space to dig his own grave. The more Pollson escalated, the more obvious his harassment would become. Bumpy was waiting for the right moment, one where striking back would look like self-defense. The second incident came on Monday, October 19th, in the communal shower. Johnson was already inside when Pollson entered. Dozens of open shower heads. But Pollson walked straight toward Bumpy and shoved him hard. Johnson slipped, caught himself against the wall. "That's my shower, slur," Pollson said loudly so everyone could hear. "Find another one. This one's for white men." Johnson looked at him for several seconds, water dripping, silence hanging, then simply moved to a different stall and kept washing. Again, no reaction. Again. People were confused. Pollson had just shoved him and said that to his face, Williams said, and Bumpy just walked away. But those of us who knew Bumpy's history, we got it. He wasn't backing down. He was letting Pollson think he was weak, and that false confidence would be his downfall. The third escalation came on Wednesday, October 21st, in the yard during outdoor rec. Bumpy was walking with 2 others when Pollson stepped in front of them. "Get out of my way." "Slur," he said, arms crossed. "I walk straight. You walk around. That's how it works. White men walk straight." Johnson stared at him, then calmly stepped off the path and walked around. Pollson laughed loud enough for the whole yard to hear. "That's right, slur. You know your place. Keep walking around white men like a good slur should." By that evening, the whole prison was buzzing. Some thought Bumpy was afraid. Others, especially older inmates, believed he was planning something. Something smart. Something final. Williams asked Bumpy that night why he was letting it go. Bumpy smiled. "I'm giving him rope," he said. "If I hit him now, it'll look like I started it. I'll end up in the hole. But if I wait, he'll do something no guard can ignore. Then I can handle it, and it'll be justified. Be patient. It's coming." It came the next day, Thursday, October 22nd, afternoon recreation. Pollson spotted a younger black inmate, 23-year-old Robert Jackson, sitting alone on a bench, reading. Pollson walked over. "What are you reading, boy?" He sneered, grabbing the book from Jackson's hands. "Are there pictures in it?" "Didn't think slurs could read without pictures." Jackson was small, maybe 140 pounds, in for postal fraud. Not a fighter, he stood up politely. "Please give that back, sir. I was reading it." Pollson hit him in the face with the book. Jackson fell off the bench. The book landed in a puddle of dirty water nearby. Everyone saw it, and now it wasn't just words. It wasn't just intimidation, it was an unprovoked attack. And Bumpy had all the excuse he needed. "That's what I think of people like you who believe they're smart enough to read," Pollson said, standing over Jackson as the younger man held his face. "You're not smart. You're not equal. You belong on the ground right where I put you." Guards stepped in before things escalated any further, but the response was minimal. Pollson received nothing more than a verbal warning and the loss of 1 day of recreation. Jackson was sent to the infirmary with a split lip and a bruised face. That evening, Bumpy Johnson sat quietly with several other black inmates in their cell block. Marcus Williams was there and later said that Johnson's words made it clear something was about to happen. "Tomorrow at lunch," Bumpy said calmly, "Pollson is going to learn a lesson he'll never forget. I've been patient. I've let him believe he could disrespect me without consequences. I've let him think that being big and violent made him untouchable. Tomorrow he'll understand that size doesn't matter when someone is willing to move smarter than you." The Alcatraz cafeteria seated roughly 250 inmates at long tables arranged in straight rows. Guards were positioned around the room with clear sight lines to every seat. Meals were tightly controlled. Inmates filed in, collected their trays, sat at assigned tables, ate quietly, and left within 45 minutes. Violence during meals was rare. Everyone knew starting trouble there meant immediate solitary confinement. On Friday, October 23, 1959, lunch began around 12:15 p.m. Bumpy Johnson entered the cafeteria, collected his tray, and walked to his assigned table. He sat down with 3 other inmates and began eating without saying a word. Erik Paulson entered a few minutes later. Instead of going to his own table, Pollson walked straight toward Johnson and dropped into the empty seat across from him, slamming his tray down. "Well, well," Pollson said loudly, making sure nearby tables could hear. "If it isn't Harlem's big shot. Still sitting with your friends. Still pretending you're somebody instead of just another inmate who belongs in a cage." Johnson didn't look up. He didn't respond. He continued eating as if Pollson wasn't there. That only made Pollson angrier. "You ignoring me?" Pollson leaned forward. "You think you're too important to answer when a white man speaks? Let me make something clear. You're beneath me. And when I talk to you, you respond or you deal with the consequences." Then Pollson turned his attention across the room. "Hey," he shouted toward Robert Jackson, sitting several tables away, his face still bruised. "How's that face feeling today? Learn your lesson about reading books you can't understand? Maybe I should come over there and remind you." Jackson lowered his head, frozen with fear. A few inmates at his table began to rise, but guards immediately shouted for everyone to remain seated. That's when Bumpy Johnson stood up. Witnesses later said everything that followed happened in 3 or 4 seconds. As Johnson rose, his right hand moved to his waist beneath his shirt. In one smooth motion, he pulled out a small, sharpened blade that had been hidden. against his body. He stepped around the table and closed the distance between himself and Pollson. Pollson started to stand. He was too late. Johnson's arm moved in a fast, controlled motion across Pollson's face. Pollson screamed instantly, grabbing his face as blood poured down onto his shirt before anyone could react. Johnson struck again, just as quickly. Pollson fell backward over the bench and hit the floor, screaming and clutching his face as guards rushed in from every direction. The cafeteria fell silent in just a few seconds. Everything had changed. The cafeteria exploded into chaos. Guards blew whistles and shouted for everyone to hit the ground. Inmates scattered or ducked under tables. Within seconds, 5 guards had surrounded Bumpy Johnson with weapons drawn, while 2 others rushed to Erik Paulson, who was on the floor, blood streaming from his face. Johnson calmly dropped the blade, raised his hands, and allowed the guards to take him down and cuff him without a struggle. But before they could drag him away, before they checked Pollson's pulse or called for medical help, Bumpy said one sentence. A sentence every man in that room would remember. One that would echo in prison stories for the next 50 years. Touch that young brother again, call him that word one more time, and next time you won't visit a doctor. You'll visit God. Eric Pollson survived the attack, but he was never the same. The first slash across his face needed 127 stitches. The scar ran from his cheekbone to his jaw, a permanent reminder. The second cut destroyed his right eye completely. Emergency surgery removed what was left. Pollson would spend the rest of his life blind on one side. He was moved to the prison hospital, where he remained for 2 weeks. According to medical staff, the physical wounds were bad, but the psychological ones ran even deeper. The man who once bragged about being untouchable was now quiet, withdrawn. The rage and intimidation were gone. The swagger gone. What Bumpy had done in 3 seconds destroyed years of fear. Pollson had built through size and violence. He never messed with another black inmate again, said Marcus Williams. He learned what every bully eventually learns. If they live long enough, size doesn't matter when someone moves faster, smarter, and with no hesitation. Bumpy Johnson had proved a point. That 275 pounds of muscle meant nothing if your opponent knew when and how to strike and had the resolve to finish. Johnson was immediately placed in solitary confinement while the incident was investigated. That process took 2 weeks and included interviews with dozens of witnesses. And what the investigators found was exactly what Bumpy had planned. Multiple inmates testified that Pollson had been harassing black prisoners for weeks. He'd taken food from Bumpy's tray, shoved him in the showers, blocked his path in the yard, and hurled racial slurs constantly. Others confirmed that Pollson had attacked Robert Jackson just the day before, hitting him in the face with a book and mocking him in front of the entire yard. Several witnesses said Pollson sat at Johnson's table uninvited on the day of the incident, used slurs again, and threatened Jackson from across the cafeteria. Bumpy's statement was simple. Defended myself and another inmate from a racist prisoner who had been threatening us all week. I used the minimum force needed to make sure he stopped. I warned him. I told him after the attack that if he continued, it would be worse next time. I don't regret defending myself. I don't regret defending Robert Jackson. I regret that violence was necessary, but it was only necessary because the guards weren't protecting us. After 2 weeks in the hole, prison officials made a decision that surprised many. Johnson would serve 30 days total in solitary for possession of a weapon and assault. But they chose not to add more years to his sentence. Why? Because the evidence showed what many already knew, that Pollson had been provoking black inmates for years, and guards had done little to stop it. They knew he'd attacked Jackson. They knew he'd targeted Bumpy that day. Punishing Bumpy too harshly would mean admitting the system had failed to act and had left inmates to fend for themselves. They didn't want to say it out loud, Williams explained. But they knew. They knew who the real threat had been. Giving Bumpy 30 days was just enough to follow the rules without admitting that they let it happen. Then they transferred Pollson to another facility after he recovered, quietly moving the problem somewhere else. What happened in that cafeteria on October 23, 1959, became legend. Not just inside Alcatraz, but across the federal prison system. Inmates who were transferred took the story with them. Guards talked about it in training sessions. The tale spread until it became part of prison culture, and Bumpy Johnson's name became something more than just respected. It became iconic. What made the story so powerful were the details, the patience. Johnson endured a full week of abuse without reacting. He let Pollson get comfortable, let him believe there would be no consequences. He waited until the moment retaliation would be justified and unmistakable. The precision. 2 slashes in 3 seconds. One man disarmed, disfigured, and disabled, all before the guards could move or the victim could defend himself. The weapon. No one knew where it came from. No one knew how Bumpy had hidden it so well. The mystery added to the legend. To many, it suggested that Bumpy had access, resources, and skill beyond the average inmate. The message. Touch that young brother again, and next time you'll visit God. It was the kind of threat that didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a promise. It was calm, clear, direct, and coming from someone who had just backed it up with action, it carried the weight of absolute truth. The age factor. Bumpy Johnson wasn't young. He wasn't the biggest man in the room. But he was the sharpest, in mind, in timing, and in understanding the rules of the game. That's what turned the cafeteria incident from a violent act into something else entirely. It became a moment of balance. A message that bullies don't always win. That respect, once earned, has to be defended. And that sometimes, in places like Alcatraz, justice doesn't come from the guards. It comes from the table across the room. Bumpy Johnson was 54 when he went after Erik Paulson, who was 38, taller, heavier, and stronger. That detail became part of the legend. It wasn't just the violence, it was who had done it, how, and why. An older, smaller man had dismantled a younger, more physically dominant bully in just seconds. It proved something every inmate understood deep down. In places like Alcatraz, intelligence and experience were worth more than size or strength. And soon, that legend spread. In less than a year, every federal prison in the country had heard the story, said Marcus Williams. Atlanta, Leavenworth, Marion, inmates were talking about it everywhere, especially black inmates. They saw it as justice, real justice. One of their own had stood up to a racist bully and ended it. Not with empty words, but with action. With finality. The story became a quiet kind of inspiration, not just a tale of violence, but of timing and resolve. If you were being harassed by someone who thought they were untouchable, the message was simple. Be patient. Be strategic. And when it's time, make sure they never forget it. When Bumpy Johnson walked out of solitary after 30 days, everything had changed. According to inmates who were there, racist white prisoners, the ones who used to throw slurs around without a second thought, stopped talking when Bumpy walked into a room. They understood now that crossing him wasn't just risky, it could be permanent. Younger black inmates looked at him differently too, with respect, with something close to reverence. He defended one of their own when no one else could, and he'd paid the price to do it. Even the guards changed. They watched Johnson differently. Not like another inmate, but like someone who had made a statement the entire prison had heard. After the Pollson incident, Williams said, "Nobody messed with Bumpy. Nobody touched his food. Nobody bumped him in the showers. Nobody used slurs in front of him. He might have looked like an aging inmate past his prime, but everybody knew the truth now. He was more dangerous than men half his age. Because he was smarter, more patient, and if you gave him a reason, he'd hurt you in a way you'd never recover from." That reputation followed Johnson through his final years at Alcatraz, until he was released in 1963. But it didn't just protect him, it protected others. Racist inmates understood something now. If they went after another black inmate, they might end up on Bumpy's radar. And nobody wanted that dot as for Robert Jackson, the 23-year-old inmate who Pollson had been threatening the day of the cafeteria attack. He served the rest of his sentence at Alcatraz and was released in 1962, years later. Jackson would tell his family that the incident had changed him forever. "Mr. Johnson saved me that day," Jackson said after his release. "Pollson had been tormenting me for weeks. I'm small. I'm not a fighter. I thought I had no choice but to live with it. Then this man, who barely knew me, risked everything to stop it. He didn't have to. He just did." Jackson said the moment taught him what courage looked like, and that sometimes, when peaceful options fail, justice requires something more. After his release, Jackson kept a newspaper clipping about Johnson's 1968 death. When Jackson passed away in 1997, his family found that clipping folded in his wallet next to a handwritten note. "He saved me when no one else would. He showed me what courage looks like." RJ, 1962. As for Erik Paulson, he was transferred out of Alcatraz in December 1959, just 2 months after the incident, and sent to USP Leavenworth in Kansas. Physically, he was a different man. A deep scar down his face, blind in one eye. But it was the psychological damage that stuck. According to inmates at Leavenworth, Pollson was no longer loud or aggressive. He worked quietly, kept to himself, never picked fights. He served the rest of his sentence in silence and was released in 1971. He returned to Texas, bounced between labor jobs, and died in 1989 at the age of 68. People who knew him later said he rarely spoke about his time in prison, but when he did, he'd touch the scar on his face and say, "I thought I was the most dangerous man at Alcatraz. Turns out I wasn't even close." Bumpy Johnson left Alcatraz in November 1963, after serving 10 years of his 15-year sentence. He returned to Harlem and, according to many, reclaimed his old empire. He lived quietly, away from the spotlight, until July 1968, when he died of a heart attack at age 62. But the story he left behind, the one from that cafeteria on October 23, 1959, would outlive him by decades. The tale passed through prison walls like wildfire. It was retold by inmates, passed on in whispers, written about in books, and remembered by anyone who'd ever served time with Bumpy Johnson. It wasn't just a fight, it was a message, and it carried weight because of how it happened. The patience. Bumpy didn't strike the first time he was disrespected, or the second, or even the third. He waited, he watched. He made sure that when he acted, no one could say it wasn't justified. The speed and precision. 2 slashes. 3 seconds. A man changed forever. Guards couldn't stop it. Pollson couldn't defend against it. That kind of efficiency turned a violent act into something closer to legend, the mystery. No one ever figured out where Bumpy got the blade or how he got it into the cafeteria. That only made the story stronger, like he was always 3 steps ahead. The warning. Next time, you'll visit God. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't angry. It was calm, direct, and after what he'd just done, completely believable. That line became one of the most quoted in prison culture, a final warning used by inmates who meant what they said. And the age. He wasn't in his prime. He wasn't the biggest. But he was still the most dangerous man in the room, not because of how hard he could hit, but because he always knew when to strike. That's what made Bumpy legendary. Not the violence itself, but the brilliance behind it. Marcus Williams, who remained close with Johnson after their release, said it best. People knew Bumpy had been a boss in Harlem. But what happened in that cafeteria showed something deeper. It showed he was still the most dangerous man in any prison because he was smart enough to wait and cold enough to finish it when the time came. That's what the story became. A warning. A lesson. A legend. Because on October 23, 1959, Eric Pollson learned the hard way that disrespecting Bumpy Johnson didn't come with second chances. That patience wasn't weakness. And that when Bumpy finally stood up, you were already too late.